Greetings, this is the Questing GM. So this is RPG A Day 2020, day number 13, and the word of the day is rest. Rest is a very interesting word because you can probably say in a dungeon crawling fantasy RPG, it is considered one of the high points or hallmarks of the experience. That after a day's work of killing monsters, taking their stuff, taking damage, the end of the day ends with a rest, and the purpose of the rest is to regain all the resources that you've spent uh, and renew them, and so that you can proceed on with the next day of killing monsters, taking their stuff, and taking damage. Rest in Dungeons and Dragons, particularly, has been the target of some criticism, and the criticism that is usually levied against rest in 5th edition is typically that it's too easy. Everything is too easy. You take minor wounds, all you need to do is just take an hour break, and you are ready to you're patched up, ready to go. You take some massive wounds, and you just have to take a long rest, and you are back to full health. Everything's tip top, and you're ready to go. There's some back and forth of people who feel that everything's too easy. Everything hit points is regained at such an easy rate and such an easy way that it takes out any kind of visibility of the rest of damages and wounds. Obviously, this is all very debatable because hit points in Dungeons and Dragons in particular hasn't always represented physical wounds. It is an abstraction of representation of luck, mental fortitude, maybe some physical wounds are involved, but and some of these resources can be refocused or regained through a proper amount of time of rest. But nevertheless, D&D itself also has provided variants of these rest rules. They have, if I believe in the DMG, if you look in the variant rules for rest, they suggest that you can extend the period of rest just to gain the same amount of healing that you would normally get from what was the default. For example, like if I believe I believe the rule is something along the lines of, instead of a long rest being a day, it could be a week, and the amount of hit points that you gain in a short rest could be done within a day. So that's an extension of the duration to gain the same amount of benefits, and that's supposed making it seem a bit more real. Uh, it's not necessarily my favorite way to handle this, because it's just a matter of extension of time, and how do we deal with the extension of time? Most of the time is we probably just hand wave it and say you've taken that amount of time to get the same amount of rest. As it is right now, uh, rest is pretty much just a stop. You've taken all the damages and you just want to take a stop in the pacing of the game, a stop in the narrative of the game, go through the rest, and then just move on with your day. So there's nothing inherently wrong with this idea of why we overpower rest, or why we overestimate the abilities of rest, and because the reason is we don't want this stop period to last too long. Otherwise, what's the reason for that? It becomes a frustrating process that every party has to go through just to get on to the action. What I am proposing for this video, at least, and this is definitely not trying to be a replacement of rest. It's just more of, let's try to make rest a little bit more interesting, and maybe allow us to take into account some factors or some qualities of rest that we can probably make rest something more unpredictable. And if that's and whether that's a good thing, it's really up to your personal taste and preferences. So before I talk about this idea that I have for rest, and these are generally just ideas, not necessarily firm mechanics. I think you can easily be these ideas can be easily emulated or simulated in some way or another from other systems other than D&D. But obviously D&D is the base and inspiration for this. But I think it has some universal qualities that it can be used in other systems if you see fit. But anyways, before I talk about the actual rest rest mechanics that I have, ideas of rest mechanics that I have, I think the first thing I need to address is the idea of damages and the types of damages. So in D&D we have hit points, but do you also need to remember that if you look closely into the rules, there are other reasons why you would want to take a rest That's not necessary to regain hit points. I believe if you look at under the downtime activities, you would see things like you can rest just to recover from diseases. You can rest to recover from poisons, and one thing that I think that's not often seen, at least in the D&D context, is illness. It's not severe enough to be a disease that requires very proper treatment or even magical treatment, but just general illnesses that weakens the body for a period of time. And the way to recovery is typically through taking proper care and proper rest. So I think we need to differentiate the types of damages first, because only by knowing what kind of damage that's being taken, only then we can try to apply the proper types of rest that would be appropriate to recover from those types of damages. So wounds are obviously one of the most typical one. It could, and we could be talking about hit points. We could be talking about actual physical wounds that that has lacerations, that requires some sort of maybe stitching. Blood loss is also another typical result of physical wounds. These types of damages usually takes, first of all, some really quick first aid, just to prevent blood loss, and then after that you need to let the natural healing process go through, so that the body actually recovers itself. Poisons is also another one, probably very similar to physical wounds. Also requires very urgent first aid, just to ensure that the poison doesn't spread throughout the body, or at least inflicts the part of the body that is intentionally made to damage. It's not necessarily a matter of stitching somebody up, but it's a matter of applying the right antidotes, maybe even having to try to suppress the symptoms of the poisons, so that it doesn't do as much damage as it could possibly do. Diseases is probably something that is something that needs a bit more long-term care, and it depends on the nature of the disease and how it's inflicted. And in a fantasy role-playing game, the context is typically something that's magical in nature. So there may be some magic involved that has to be brought in to control the disease, or maybe it's just a matter of providing proper long-term care just to remove the effects of the disease, or if some diseases may not even be curable, in that sense that it will always stay with the character, and it's just a maintenance of ensuring that the effects of the disease do not incapacitate the character, the afflicted character, for long periods of time to be ineffective in a party setting. And then there's like the smaller scale damages, like sickness, common flus, diarrheas, or things like that. Things that probably are not as serious as diseases, but probably requires the same type of care that is required for diseases, but in a shorter period, and maybe much more recoverable. But at the same time, we cannot underestimate that some minor illnesses can be symptoms to a larger diseases. So you may be able to cure someone or heal someone on a short-term basis, but never on a long-term basis, without identifying the actual cause for those minor illnesses. So once we've identified what type of damages that the character has taken, then we can come down to next to the step of what is the appropriate response to those type of damages. I've pretty much broken it down to a few things. First of all, it's the urgency of care, and depending on the type of damage, like I said, if it's a physical wound, if it's a poison, then it may require very urgent care, because the idea of applying first aid in this case is to try to minimize the potential damage that it could do. So this means that the type of damage like wounds and poisons may actually have a maximum number of damage it could deal, and so therefore the idea is if you apply the first aid too slowly, then that's the amount of damages that you as the carer, or whoever's the one doing the caring, has to recover from. So it's best to try to minimize that as much as possible. Whereas when we're talking about diseases and illnesses, they may not be so urgent. They can be the beginning of its treatment can happen at a much later time, because it may only have a consistent amount of damages or negative effects over a period of time if not treated well. for in the case of sickness, it may lead to more serious diseases, but not most of the time you do not have to urgently, cut someone up just to remove a disease out of somebody. I mean, that could be one of the methods that you choose to do so, but uh, it's not necessarily as urgent as, say, trying to stitch up a wound of any kind. So that's urgency. So I guess, depending on the type of damage, how important is the urgency of the first aid, of the first treatment to begin, that could play a factor. So by using urgency, we can determine uh, what are the amount of damage that has to be recovered from. Now, the second element I would look at is care. The amount of care, the quality of care that is given, and this is something that's probably something that's not, typically really thought through in in a game like Dungeons and Dragons. Having a we only think about having a place to rest. We never really think about having the person caring for the one who's resting. But I believe this is something that was relatively covered in, I believe, in 3.5 rules, where the person with a healing medicine check is able to apply additional healing using their skills to grant additional healing, hit point recovery from that check. But this is not the case anymore in 5th edition, at least, because you can just take a short rest and you recover back to full, and there's no requirement for a carer to be available on site to provide additional healing. So I think this is somewhere where we can try to put back this element into 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, that giving opportunity for someone with the appropriate skill to actually apply extra bonuses in terms of the recovery rate. And because if you look at the current 5th edition for the medicine skill, it mainly only applied for stabilizing a character. So uh, so there's no other application for it after that point. Once the character has stabilized, then the process of healing is basically on each character's own, and the healer has really no much say to that. Now, another aspect of the skill of the carer is the comfort level of the place of rest. Uh, this is probably something also that's not really thought of. A character who sleeps on the dungeon floor recovers at the same rate as a character who sleeps in a mansion on a four-post bed. We probably feather pillows and stuff. So I think that's something that we can also take into consideration. There may having a more comfortable place for rest may increase the rate of recovery. Maybe either more hit points, or maybe reduces the damage or duration of, say, sicknesses and illnesses. Safety is also a very important concern in terms of where the place of rest is. If there's a constant security concern, or like typically in a resting place, and you are being attacked in the middle of the rest, what happens after that? And there's also the idea of a stress level, or having a peace and quiet, a place where you have peace and quiet to rest, compared with constantly having noise or arguments or fights or brawls happening. That can help differentiate between resting in a private mansion compared to resting in an inn. And I think if that can be played into a factor, depending on the place of rest and its conditions, taking the place of rest conditions into account, we can determine a different rate of recovery, based on those conditions. So typically, we would like to try to move towards something that is more safe and quiet, rather than something that is more uncomfortable and noisy. Food is also another area that I think that D&D doesn't really also cover very well. And the funny thing is, we have spells like Hero's Feast that allows you to recover back to full hit points just by eating. But other than that, the only mechanics that food is involved is just to stave off hunger. But I think if you've been sick before, you will know that certain foods are actually very nutritious, very beneficial, and that is the basis for medicine itself. That certain things that we consume and put into our body has certain effects to our biology, that actually helps us with the recovery process. So Food is definitely something that we can definitely try to mechanize, different types of foods. uh, this is probably another area where herbalism can come to play. uh, using the right herbs to counteract the certain effects is probably good, and usually maybe even the most common way to counteract things like diseases and illnesses. Speak to any Chinese medicinal practitioner and they'll tell you, that's how Chinese patients get through certain illnesses and sickness. And because food is good for you, and you know having hearty meals, or at least healthy meals, should be differentiated from having a normal meal, a common meal, or just enough food to keep you from hunger. There's obviously the question of the quantity and the quality of supplies, because this becomes a little bit of a resource management problem. Uh, does the place where the person is resting have the right amount or right quality of food, medicine, supplies to ensure that the patient doesn't go unfed. These are some of the factors, urgency, care, comfort, food. These are the factors that we can definitely add on to each other or stack them among each other, just to determine a base rate of recovery. And I'll get into a little bit of that, of why even though we have a base rate, it may not necessarily be the total amount or the final amount. I think we can make it a little bit more interesting with another final step for that. But before I get into that final step, there's another thing we should talk about that affects our quality of rest, which is the interruption of rest. What are the conditions of interruption of rest? As I said, I think any disruption of any of the qualities that I mentioned earlier would probably constitute as disruption of rest, which means that we are not resting at the optimal rate for whatever illnesses whatever damages we're trying to overcome. If you tried to rest from illness before, you will probably know that yes, there's some minor things in life that can really annoy your resting and healing process. So what are some of the typical distractions that we have? I would think that if there's any sort of interruption, like the most typical of your resting in the night and then suddenly you're being ambushed by monsters during someone's watch, there's an interruption. And this has caused numerous debates on the D&D 5e context, because if you're long resting, and by raw you're actually supposed to complete the entire long rest duration to gain the benefits of the long rest, but if something interrupts you in between, what exactly happens? And then there's that caveat of 15 minutes or something like that by Jeremy Crawford, who clarified that you lose the benefits of rest if you perform certain activities over extended period of time. And yeah, that becomes another whole entanglement that just makes the whole resting period more confusing than it needs to be. But yeah, there are definitely ways you can interrupt someone's rest, causing stress, physical stress, mental stress even sometimes, and having very clear mechanics like what constitutes as an interruption or undoing of rest. So we can take some inspirations maybe from the concentration mechanics, that you're trying to concentrate on resting, but there may be certain things that if you try to do that will make you undo whatever concentration that you have. And what are the punishments of not getting the proper rest results in? Is it a lower rate of recovery? Is it a smaller amount of hit points regained? Or is it the resting that you have done up to this point is entirely lost because of whatever the conditions that have been met? And then there's the variation of rest quality. So depending on the elements that I mentioned, if the level of care is not consistent, then the base rate will obviously fluctuate. Same goes with the skill of the carer. Same goes with the comfort. That as each of these elements have their own scales and variations, then the resulting amount of recovery that we gain would also fluctuate based on those conditions. So that can be in a way an interruption of rest. Now, the final step, or at least my final idea, is that once these are mostly just factors that build in together to determine a base rate of rest, to add some more unpredictability, because not every human body recovers at the same rate. Different people, someone can be down with a cold for a week, someone can be down with a cold for a month, and that's also assuming that everyone gets the same amount of care or rest that they have. But different bodies react differently. So what I'm proposing here is that after having all these factors built in, we can determine a base rate, and then we have to probably come up with a check, make a check to determine how much of that base rate do we gain. Do we gain above the base rate? Do we gain below the base rate? Do we gain exactly at the base rate? And this can be as easily done as a constitution saving throw or something like that along those lines, just to put in that factor of how our body reacts to damages and recovering from it. You just can this can be maybe in some way even applied by using a wisdom saving throw if it's involving some mental damages, especially from diseases, magical diseases, not in a mental health way, but magical mental diseases in a D&D context that can be caused. What's the point of doing all this? For, like I said, if you prefer something simple and straightforward, and if you see rest as just a stopgap measure in the process of the game, then I really don't see anything better than making it as simple as possible, which is short rest, long rest, and just move on. What my reasons for doing making rest something simple as rest so complicated in most eyes, and even to myself, is I think because we need to make rest a more rewarding experience rather than something that is a managed experience. And by adding some random elements to it, or at least having putting more care to thought on how we can use rest as a encounter or a challenge in its own way, I think makes it a bit more rewarding, and then therefore it also opens up another branch of of having characters built in a certain way. We have clerics that only rely on magical healing, and if you that puts a heavy emphasis on having a cleric who can heal. But if we have any other character that has some skills with medicine, more natural healing processes, and they know exactly, and they know what factors they can use to overcome their deficits in terms of magical healing, then I think there is an interesting way we can create those characters without having to rely on healing classes, so to speak. One other idea of why I want it to be a bit more random in this sense is also because it also sort of serves a second purpose of determining duration. So as I said, if we have by having a base rest recovery, and then making a final check to determine how much of that we do we gain or do we lose, then we are never sure of how long it takes to fully recover, because it's a day by day thing, or whatever interval period that you decided to set for your system or for D&D or whatnot. It could be a daily check, and maybe if the person has only taken very minor wounds, it could all recover within a day. If it's something that's much more serious, it could take several weeks, because there's a lot of damage to recover from, and you have to make the check, and there are good days and there'll be bad days, pretty much like anyone who's been sick, especially for a long term of time. In a way, I think this makes rest something more interesting. It becomes another moment of play. You have exploring, you have combat, and then you have rest. This really bumps up the importance of rest as part of the entire gameplay loop, so to speak. And maybe that's something that you're looking for in your Dungeons and Dragons game, or even any other fantasy game. And I can definitely see this is actually much more relevant in a more modern setting, because if the modern setting doesn't have any sort of doesn't have magical healing or super science to recover people at instant rates, I think this is actually lending a lot more realism to the resting process, that rest shouldn't come so easily, and get on with the day. It can actually put someone out of commission for relatively long time, and that puts a price on the risk reward ratio between doing something daring that could potentially cause a lot of damage and then therefore requires a long amount of rest, or being very careful and conservative so that you can minimize damage, so that you will not require a long amount of rest. So these are all just some thoughts that I have really been inside my head for quite a while when it comes to the idea of rest, some problems that we have with rest, and these are just some ways that we can make rest a little bit more interesting, which is something that I always like to do even for whatever system. And maybe with the elements that I mentioned earlier, it gives you an idea or directions on how we can think about REST in your games, uh, whether it's your own homebrew system or whether it's any existing system that you're currently using, because then I think it helps to make REST, a different part of the game. That's about all I have to really talk about for RPG a day 13, REST. And hope it benefits someone or gives someone some real ideas on how they could use REST in their game. So I'll see you on day 14 for RPG a day 2020.